Fellas, it seems like every week I'm complaining with something to do with the UFC, so I thought this week we'd appreciate the greatness of UFC 314 and what made it such a good pay-per-view, and undoubtedly, it's definitely one of the best pay-per-views we've had in the past couple of years. I think, personally, since UFC 300, it's the best pay-per-view we've had, and the fan reception online for this card has been overwhelmingly positive. You know, people saying it's the best card of the year, people saying it's just, it feels like the old UFC all over again. So I'm going to be going over what made UFC 314 such a great pay-per-view, and how the UFC can learn from this in the future. Now, number one, I think the most important and simple reason is it's stacked on paper. Like I said before, I think this is the most stacked card we've had since UFC 300. It's between that and UFC 308. Some people would debate 308. I personally think it's 314. But just look at the card overall. You've got the featherweight title bout, Alexander Volkanovski returning after a layoff against up-and-coming title contender Diego Lopez of the main event. Two fan favorites in a win-win situation. The co-main event, you've got Michael Chandler and Paddy Pimblett. Paddy Pimblett, this rising star, some people think is a hype job, but undoubtedly a big star, against Michael Chandler, who's already solidified himself as a big name in the lightweight division. In the featured fight, you've got Yair Rodriguez, a top contender, against Patricio Pitbull, who's one of the biggest names and arguably the greatest fighter outside of the UFC. So that was also a big fight for the featured fight. And then before that, you had number 13 Bryce Mitchell versus Gene Silver, which doesn't seem like a big fight on paper, but because of the rivalry, ended up being huge. And then you've got Dominic Reyes returning, Nikita Krylov returning against Dominic Reyes, another fan favorite. And then even the prelims were insane too. A number one contender fight in the women's strawweight division, Danny Ige versus Sean Woodson, a bunch of other good fights in there as well. And bearing in mind, this was supposed to have Carlos Prates and Jeff Neal on as well, which would have made it even more ridiculous. So I think the name value, how stacked this card was from top to bottom, the prelims and the main card, overall contributed to the vast majority of why this card was such a good pay-per-view. And I think personally, this isn't some statistic that I've, managed to bring out of anywhere, but I think personally, a stacked card is 85% of a card being successful. It just comes down to it being stacked. I mean, look at some of the best cards we've had in UFC history, both recently and in history. I think all of them have in common the fact that they are stacked. I mean, look at UFC 301, for example. Did this card perform well? Yes, it performed well. The main event, Pantoja and Usyk, was a scrap. Aldo returned and put a beating on Jonathan Martinez. There were a couple of good finishes throughout the card. Was it stacked? No, it wasn't stacked. It's notoriously one of the worst cards we've had in the past couple of years in the UFC when it comes to pay-per-views, but it performed well, but simply because it wasn't stacked. The fan reception was poor for this card. And UFC 314, it was stacked from top to bottom. It was an amazing pay-per-view, and I feel like this is already why UFC 315 is destined to fail. Regardless of if it performs well and there's a bunch of good fights, I don't see this card going well because it's not stacked on paper. So I think the number one reason, the most important contributing factor to why UFC 314 was a good card is because it was stacked on paper. Number two, emotional ties to certain fighters. I feel like there's been more emotional ties to this card than we've had in a long time for a pay-per-view. Number one, Alexander Volkanovski. Is he washed or is he coming back? Now, obviously, Volkanovski is the greatest featherweight of all time, or at least one of the greatest featherweights of all time, depending on who you think it is. Dominated the featherweight division for years. Looked like he was unstoppable. One of the best champions we've had in the modern era of the UFC. And as a person, just a super likable person. You cannot dislike Alexander Volkanovski, one of the most likable champions we've had recently. And then to go from that to suddenly getting knocked out by Islam Makhachev and then getting knocked out by Ilia Topuria back-to-back. We never knew if Volkanovski was going to come back. We thought maybe this was going to be the fight where he gets chinned and retires. Maybe he's done for all. And then he gets obviously booked against Diego Lopez, wins the belt back, makes history. And that was another emotional moment for a lot of MMA fans. Dominic Reyes, from chinny to chinning, obviously has his big raz in the UFC, knocking everybody out, gets the fight with John Jones, gets criminally robbed in one of the worst robberies in UFC history against John Jones, and then it just goes downhill. Gets knocked out by Jan Blachowicz, knocked out by Braska, knocked out by Ryan Spann, and then the whole conversation of Dominic Reyes retiring comes out of everywhere. He needs to retire, he's washed, his chin's holding up, is going to be the next BJ Penn. And then last year, in June, knocks out Dustin Jacoby, he's now back in the winning column. Then he beats the crap out of Anthony Smith, now he's on a winning streak. And then he goes out there and knocks out Nikita Krylov, now he's on a 3-fight winning streak, beating a guy in the top 10, and he's now literally a win away from a title shot. And then in the featured fight of the card, you've kind of got Team Bryce versus Team Mitchell. It kind of seemed like that fight was split into two massive fan bases where there was a lot of emotion of who's going to win that fight. And you look at a card like UFC 311, for example. Great card, great main card, but there was no emotional connection to any fight in the main card. Like, no one really cared about who won or lost in any of the fights. So I think the emotional ties is another massive reason why UFC 314 was so successful. Number three, the rivalries. Rivalries are probably the best way to build a fight in the UFC, or just in combat sports in general. The anticipation, the build-up, the trash talk, everything about rivalries builds in like so much excitement for a fight. And we saw that on this card. Gene Silver versus Bryce Mitchell. I can't remember the last time I was this excited for a fight that wasn't like a title fight or like a big #1 contender fight. I was so hyped for Gene Silver versus Bryce Mitchell. You've got a guy who's borderline unranked and a guy who is unranked. And the way that they built it, the trash talk, the way that they had so much animosity to each other. And then even Yair Rodriguez and Diego Lopez, they ain't even fighting each other, but they've pretty much secured themselves a fight for both of them next. You know, they were just going at it. They stole the show at the press conference for UFC 314. Another example of a massive rivalry, and that ultimately resulted in Bryce Mitchell and Gene Silver being the people's main event, and a fight that everybody wants to see at UFC 320 between Diego Lopez and Yair Rodriguez. And in contrast, the vast majority of press conferences are super boring. Dull questions from the media, nothing from the fighters, barely any trash talk, and if it is, it's just super lame shit that seems overforced. So I think the rivalries that was on this card really built some excitement into a lot of the fights. I think a fourth reason could be a mix of prospects and legends. We had so many good prospects on this card. For example, Chase Hooper, big grappling prospect at 155, went out there and beat a veteran in Jim Miller and is now riding the winning streak. So Chase Hooper's a prospect on the card. Gene Silver, who turned himself from a prospect into a contender by beating the crap out of Bryce Mitchell, solidifying him a place in the top 15 of the featherweight division, another big prospect. Paddy Pimblett, who a lot of people thought was a hype job, solidified himself into a top contender by beating the crap out of Michael Chandler, proving that he's not just a hype job and he is legit in the lightweight division. And also guys like Marco Tulio and Sean Woodson, who competed on the card as prospects. And then the veterans, Patricio Pitbull, arguably the greatest fighter to never fight inside of the UFC in the modern generation, apart from obviously guys like Fedor Emelianenko. But yeah, Patricio Pitbull, massive name outside the UFC. Jim Miller, who's been in the UFC for the longest time, has such a great resume in the UFC. Some of the best longevity for 155 as well. This guy is up there in age at 155, and for the fact that he's been competing for so long, massively impressive. Dominic Reyes, now I know he's not been in the UFC since the early days, but he's had quite a long run in the UFC. He's been out in the UFC for quite some time, and he's still obviously thriving in 2025. And then even Volkanovski, an OG to the featherweight division, a guy who's been in the UFC for so long, him in the main event, another veteran in the card. I feel like it had a perfect mix of prospects to get excited about and veterans, and I feel like they're both crucial for a card. You get no prospects on a card, nobody's going to get excited for it. There's no implications because there's nobody to look forward to, and if there's no veterans, it's not as bad as having no prospects, but you still want to see the old heads compete every now and then. So I feel like it had a perfect mix of both prospects and legends. Number 5, one of the most important reasons, is the way the fights actually played out. UFC 313 was a good card on paper. You know, it wasn't an overstacked card. It wasn't terrible on paper. But I feel like the card itself didn't perform that well. Half of the fights were fun. Half of the fights were boring. And it's unreliable for a pay-per-view. The vast majority of fight nights that we've been having recently have been boring too. Whereas UFC 314, it wasn't just stacked on paper and it under-delivered. It didn't perform as well. Nearly every fight on this card was fun. I'd say there was only like 2 fights on this card that was boring. From Volkanovski and Diego Lopez having a war in the main event that could have been finished at any moment, to Paddy Pimblett beating the crap out of Michael Chandler in the co-main event, Gene Silver and Bryce Mitchell delivering where Gene Silver destroys Bryce Mitchell, Yair Rodriguez and Pitbull. I know that wasn't a barn burner, but from a technical perspective, it was quite a good fight to see. And then Dominic Reyes chinning Nikita Krylov, solidifying himself a place in the top 10. And the prelims were amazing too. The amount of finishes on this card as well. I think the last time we had this many finishes on a card must have been way back at UFC Seattle. Only 5 decisions on an entire pay-per-view card. From what we've been getting recently is massively impressive. And a lot of the pay-per-views and just cards in general that we've had recently in the UFC have kind of failed to deliver. A lot of the fight nights have just been massively dull. A lot of fight night main events, and even just most of the fights, just we've been seeing a trend recently in cards where there's been way more decisions than finishes. So I feel like the fight performances from UFC 314 was another reason why it was an amazing card. So I feel like when you add it all together, rivalries, emotional connection, fun fights, veterans, prospects, and a stacked card, it's a recipe for success. The emotional connection to Alexander Volkanovski, the rivalry between Gene Silver and Bryce Mitchell, the fun fights throughout the card, the prospects and the veterans, and the fact that it was a stacked card was amazing. And I feel like this is a recipe for a good card. Look at UFC 300, which most would consider the greatest card of all time. Again, it had rivalries, it had fun fights, it had emotion tied to it, it had veterans and prospects, and on top of it, it was an amazingly stacked card, and these just result in amazing cards. So I feel like, what can the UFC learn from this card in future? Because like I said, before this card, the UFC was in a bit of a bad spot. So what can they take forward after the UFC 314? I think number 1, every pay-per-view should be somewhat stacked. UFC 315 is coming up in a couple of weeks, in May. And what is this card? Bilal Muhammad and JDM in the main event. Shevchenko and Fiorot, and then Grasso and Natalia Silva. 2 women's fights in a row. Jose Aldo, a legend, taking on Ayman Zahabi of all people. And then Yoel Alvarez and Benoit Saint Denis is a banger. I feel like they could have made this card better. They could have had a big featured fight, for example, like a Cyril Gane and a Gelton Almeida. They could have given a better opponent to Jose Aldo, maybe like a Cody Garbrandt, even though it was a bit of a mismatch, and then kept BSD and Yoel Alvarez on the main card. And before everyone complains that the UFC can't afford to stack every card, there's 128 ranked men in the UFC. The UFC can stack each card. Like, if we're going to look at the O'Malley and Merab card, for example, they can make that into a really good card too. You know, Joaquin Buckley versus Usman as the featured fight. Aaron Pico coming over to the UFC, just like Patricio Pitbull to take on Arnold Allen. Johnny Walker versus Azamat Mirzakhanov, which I think is on the card anyway. That can be pretty similar to UFC 314. Even UFC 312, the worst pay-per-view this year, and probably is going to go down as the worst pay-per-view at the end of this year. That could have been good. You could have had like a Kai Kara-France versus Brandon Royval, #1 contender fight. Carlos Ulberg versus Jan Blachowicz could have been pushed back to this card. Benil Dariush and Fares Yam, another example of a fight that could have been on this card, considering that Dariush was supposed to fight on 311. So I feel like every pay-per-view should be somewhat stacked. I'm not saying every pay-per-view needs to be UFC 314 level of stacked, but we can't really be affording to be having these poor pay-per-views. Number 2, rivalries sell. Rivalries are, I feel this card really showed us the impact of rivalries. Bryce Mitchell and Gene Silva, like I said, I can't remember the last time I was this excited for a fight that wasn't between 2 like top guys of the division. I was looking forward to this fight more than probably any fight on the card outside of the main and the co-main event. And that was because of the rivalry that they built up. And that's why Juliana Pena versus Kayla Harrison, for example, is probably the most highly intrigued women MMA fight we've got coming up. And it's not for the fight itself. It's for the rivalry. Now, I understand it's a bit cringy, the build-up is a lot of playground insults, but at least they're trying to sell a fight. You know, you've got Juliana Pena and Kayla Harrison trying to build a fight between each other, trash-talking at every given opportunity. And that stuff sells, and that's why it's probably the most intrigued women MMA fight we've got coming up. Some potential rivalries the UFC can capitalize on. Yair Rodriguez versus Diego Lopez at 320. We saw them go out at the 314 press conference. Massive fight there. Caio Borralho's been talking a bunch of shit to Nasidim Imavov. Obviously, Paddy Pimblett and Ilia Topuria goes without saying. And even like a Marvin Vettori versus Brendan Allen. Rivalries sell. They build up so much, they just build up so much hype for a fight in the UFC, and I feel like we need to be having, or the UFC need to be looking for rivalries on the card. So the UFC should take back that rivalries definitely sell. They definitely impact a pay-per-view. And number 3, prioritize fun fights. Nearly every single fight on UFC 314 was fun. It wasn't one of these cards that stacked on paper then massively under-delivers. Nearly every single fight was thoroughly, you know, entertaining. And I feel like, for example, an example of the UFC putting together a fun fight could be an Evloev versus Sterling. That was a really fun grappling fight. The reversals, just the overall wrestling between the two of them at the highest level was fun to see. Whereas if they were to do like an Evloev versus Yair Rodriguez, that wouldn't be so fun because Rodriguez is so one-dimensional. He'd get dominated by Evloev, and Evloev being a guy with no finishing ability, it would have been a bit of a boring fight. Another example, Nikita Krylov and Dominic Reyes, another fun fight. Nikita Krylov's always balls to the wall, pedal to the metal. It's always Dominic Reyes. Whereas if you do like a Reyes versus Rakic, which a lot of people keep matchmaking, Rakic is a very defensively sound fighter who has low output. That's a boring fight. And I can think of at least one fun pay-per-view main card worthy fight in every weight class, like a Cyril Gane versus Sergey Pavlovich, Reyes versus Roundtree, Borralho versus Imavov, Brady versus Buckley, Pimblett versus Gaethje, Rodriguez versus Lopez, Jan versus Sandhagen, Manel Kape versus Brandon Royval. So I feel like the UFC need to prioritize fun matchups. It's all good stacking a card and getting a shit ton of pay-per-views, but if the fights are consistently boring and there's just too many decisions, it's going to really ruin the reputation of some of these cards that we've got, or just in the UFC in general. Then number 4 is make fans care about who wins and losses, like we did with Volkanovski. If Alexander Volkanovski lost, the MMA community would have gone to win a worldwide depression, and obviously him winning meant it was a bit of a worldwide blessing for MMA fans. Dominic Reyes, if he loses, people are going to tie the word wash to his name, and if he wins, well, he's now on a 3-fight winning streak and a potential title contender. So the UFC need to make fans care about who wins and losses. They need to bring like an emotional value to fighters. We need to be caring about who wins and loses, like we do with fighters like Alexander Volkanovski, Alex Pereira, a Tom Aspinall versus John Jones situation, Charles Oliveira. When we put these fights together, they're exciting because, you know, we're also nervous to see if they win or if they lose, and I feel like they just add an emotional connection to the UFC rather than a fight where we've got two guys where nobody cares about who wins or loses and it's kind of just there in the UFC. So I feel like that's what made UFC 314 such a great pay-per-view. Let me know if you agree with my points. If you agree, disagree. Thank you for watching.